I am happy for them, but they will know what we will do. They know what we will do.
What if I told you one of football's most respected legends secretly couldn't stand some of the biggest names in the game? Michel Platini, a genius on the pitch and a powerhouse off it, wasn't just known for his passes or politics. Behind the scenes, he had a list of rivals, betrayals, and public takedowns that shocked even his closest allies. These weren't petty squabbles, they were personal, brutal, and in some cases, career-ending. From teammates who crossed the line to modern stars who dared to challenge him, here are 5 players Michel Platini absolutely couldn't stand, and the reasons behind every feud might surprise you. Before the scandals, before the whispers, Michel Platini and Jean Larios were almost inseparable. They shared the midfield at Saint Etienne, and later for France, 2 playmakers who seemed born to understand each other. Larios sat deeper, pulling strings and creating space for Platini to drift forward. Together, they formed what many fans called the creative heart of French football in the late 1970 seconds. But behind the perfect chemistry, a story was unfolding that would become one of French football's darkest legends. In the months leading up to the 1982 World Cup, rumors began to spread through the French camp, the kind of rumors that no one wanted to believe. They claimed that Larios had become romantically involved with Christelle, the woman who would soon become Platini's wife. At first, it sounded impossible. They were teammates, friends, almost brothers, but whispers turned into headlines, and by the time the national team gathered for the World Cup in Spain, everyone inside the dressing room had heard the story. Officially, nothing was confirmed. Larios denied it, and Platini stayed silent, but players and journalists noticed the sudden change. The 2 men who once joked through training now wouldn't look each other in the eye. The atmosphere around the French camp became tense, divided, and impossible to ignore. According to several retrospective accounts, including the Portuguese and German biographies of Larios, things came to a breaking point right after France's opening match against England. Larios, they claim, was quietly dropped from the lineup. The official explanation was team discipline, but reporters at the time linked it directly to the affair rumor. Some versions of the story go even further, saying Platini gave the French staff a brutal ultimatum: "It's him or me." Whether that quote is literal or folklore, no one can say for sure, but the effect was real. Larios' World Cup was effectively over. He played only 2 matches, and by the time France reached the semi-finals, he was already gone. Years later, Larios finally broke his silence. In interviews, he admitted that he had made, quote, "a personal mistake," and said that by 1982, he and Platini were no longer even on speaking terms. He didn't try to justify it, and Platini never responded publicly. The 2 men never reconciled, and the incident followed both of them for decades. For Larios, it marked the end of what could have been a brilliant career. After 1982, he never played for France again. He left Saint Etienne, moved abroad to Montreal and Switzerland, and bounced between clubs in France, Lyon, Strasbourg, Nice, Montpellier, without ever regaining his place at the top. Football historians now describe him as the man France forgot, a player whose talent was overshadowed by one scandal he could never outrun. And for Platini, the fallout was deeply personal. He never addressed it in interviews, never showed public anger, but friends and journalists alike have said the betrayal hardened him. He became more private, more guarded, less trusting of those around him. Even today, over 40 years later, that story lives somewhere between fact and legend, confirmed by Larios himself, repeated by journalists, yet still wrapped in mystery. One thing, though, is certain: that fallout changed the French team forever. Because after Larios, Platini didn't just lose a teammate. He lost his belief that the people closest to him could ever truly be trusted. And that mindset, the need for control, the sharp judgments, the unwillingness to forgive, would shape every feud that came after, including his next clash with one of the biggest stars of modern football. Few players in modern football have divided opinion quite like Karim Benzema. To some, he's one of the most complete forwards of his generation, a player whose intelligence and timing transformed Real Madrid. To others, especially in the early years, he was brilliant but inconsistent, a star who burned bright only when the moment suited him. Michel Platini, France's golden legend turned UEFA president, leaned toward the latter view. He never seemed fully convinced by Benzema's greatness, not at Real Madrid, not even for France. In fact, One of Platini's most famous comments about him caused a storm across Europe. In an interview with beIN Sports in 2016, Platini said bluntly, "He's good, but you can't call Benzema a top player." It wasn't said with malice, it was delivered in that cold, analytical tone Platini often used when assessing talent, but the message was unmistakable. "Playing for Real Madrid," he said, "doesn't automatically make you one of the world's elite. At Madrid," he added, "the real star is Cristiano." That one line, "the real star is Cristiano," spread through French and Spanish media like wildfire. To Benzema's supporters, it felt like an unnecessary jab, a French legend tearing down another. But to those who knew Platini's philosophy, it made perfect sense. Platini had grown up believing that greatness was about more than goals or trophies. It was about commanding the game, shaping its rhythm, carrying responsibility. And in his eyes, Benzema hadn't yet shown that kind of presence. What made the moment even more interesting was that Platini's criticism came just as Benzema was finally starting to find his identity at Real Madrid. For years, he had been overshadowed by Ronaldo, often adapting his style to make the superstar shine. Platini's words cut right to that point. He saw Benzema as a supporting actor in a one-man show. And Benzema's reaction? Silence. He didn't respond publicly, at least not directly, but those close to him say he never forgot that comment. Some even believe it became part of his quiet motivation, proof that even legends doubted him. Yet, Platini's relationship with Benzema wasn't all harsh judgment. There were moments of defense times when he stood up for Benzema when others wouldn't. Years later, when critics accused Benzema of lacking patriotism because he refused to sing La Marseillaise before matches, Platini defended him. He reminded everyone that in his own generation, no one sang it either. "It doesn't make you more or less French," he said. "It's football, not a political rally." That defense shocked people. The same man who once questioned Benzema's stature was now protecting him from public outrage. But that's the contradiction that defines Platini. Critical but fair, detached but fiercely loyal when he feels someone's being treated unjustly. Even after Benzema won the Ballon d'Or in 2022, France's first in almost a quarter century, Platini couldn't resist one more piece of advice. He congratulated him warmly, but added a challenge. Now he'll have to prove it on the biggest stage to justify his status. To most people, it sounded like another dig. But for Platini, that's exactly how admiration sounded, wrapped in scrutiny, layered with expectation. He didn't believe in worshipping players, he believed in challenging them. Over the years, Benzema's career has almost become a mirror for Platini's ideals. Both men were visionaries on the ball, both faced scandal and exile, and both carried the complicated relationship between genius and judgment. And maybe that's why Platini never fully praised him, because in Benzema, he saw something of himself brilliance, mixed with controversy, beauty shadowed by baggage. To this day, that tension lingers. Platini's comment that Benzema was not a top player still pops up whenever fans debate his legacy. But looking back, it's clear Platini's issue wasn't personal, it was philosophical. For him, true greatness wasn't about the spotlight, it was about how you shaped the game around you. And until Benzema stepped out of Ronaldo's shadow, Platini wasn't ready to call him one of the greats. By the time Benzema finally reached that level, lifting the Ballon d'Or, commanding Madrid's attack, Platini was long gone from the public stage. He never took back his words, but maybe he didn't have to. Because by proving him wrong, Benzema might have done the one thing Platini respected most. He earned it. And while that rivalry was quiet, fought through interviews and unspoken pride, Platini's next feud wouldn't be so subtle. Because next, he'd take aim not at a player, but at the very people who ran the game itself. Michel Platini never liked the direction football was heading. The money, the agents, the obsession with youth transfers to him, it all felt like the sport was losing its soul. And in the middle of that shift stood one man who, in Platini's eyes, symbolized the new football machine, Arsène Wenger. Their feud didn't begin on the pitch, it began with a philosophy. In the mid-2000s, Wenger's Arsenal had become famous for discovering teenage talents from across the world. Cesc Fabregas from Spain, Gaël Clichy from France, Emmanuel Eboué from Ivory Coast. Wenger was building teams out of prodigies, and it was working. But for Platini, that wasn't progress, it was exploitation. He accused Wenger and clubs like his of buying kids too young and destroying the balance of competition. Platini argued that football's richest clubs were stealing the dreams of smaller ones, that when 15 and 16-year-old players were signed away from their hometowns, football lost a piece of its heart. He even said, if the best clubs take the best 5-year-olds, then who will Millwall have? Who will St. Etienne have? The comment hit hard. It wasn't just criticism, it was a shot at everything Wenger represented: scouting networks, global academies, youth projects that turned local clubs into stepping stones. Wenger fired back, saying Platini didn't understand how modern football worked, that clubs like Arsenal were offering these kids a future, not stealing one. The exchange lit up the headlines, but Platini didn't stop there. He began to attack what he called business football, the idea that success was measured in revenue, not artistry. Wenger, a trained economist and known perfectionist, became an easy target. Platini once said bluntly, "Wenger talks about business, I talk about football." Then came another flashpoint technology. Wenger was one of the earliest voices demanding video replays and goal line systems. Platini was firmly against them. He believed football should stay human mistakes, controversy, and all. When reporters asked if he'd reconsider, Platini smirked and said, "If Wenger wants it so badly, let him watch the replays himself." Wenger didn't take it lightly. He said he was shocked by the tone of Platini's attacks, and that a man in his position should be building bridges, not taking personal shots. The English press piled on, and even the League Managers Association publicly defended Wenger, calling Platini's words unnecessary and personal. Under pressure, Platini eventually softened. He admitted he'd been too harsh, saying even his father had called to scold him a funny twist, since Wenger had actually played under Platini's father early in his career. But even when Platini apologized, he never changed his stance. He still believed modern coaching was losing its artistry. As time went on, Platini's frustration only deepened. He began to complain that coaches were turning creative players into runners, that they were killing natural talent with rigid systems. He hated seeing gifted playmakers shoved out to the wings or told to track back instead of creating. To him, football had become robotic, predictable, mechanical, lifeless. Even recently, he's kept saying it. When asked about young attackers like Kenan Yildiz at Juventus, Platini didn't hold back. He said too many coaches are afraid to trust creativity, that they prefer safety over imagination. "You should let talent breathe," he said, "not cage it." That's always been Platini's fight, not against a single man, but against a mindset. Wenger just happened to be the perfect symbol of everything he wanted to resist: data over instinct, business over beauty, development over romance. But what made their feud fascinating is that both men were right, in their own way. Wenger saw the future. Platini wanted to protect the past. And the space between those two visions, one building, one defending, is where modern football still lives today. Their rivalry was philosophical, not personal. It wasn't about who won more matches, but about what the game should be. And Platini, ever the purist, wasn't ready to let go of the football he grew up loving, even if it meant turning against some of the game's biggest names. But the next person he clashed with didn't just represent a new football philosophy, he represented rebellion itself. Because when Platini went up against Eric Cantona, things got loud. If Michel Platini represented football's discipline and elegance, Eric Cantona was the complete opposite: chaos in human form. Charismatic, brilliant, unpredictable, and utterly defiant. Their paths were different, but their stories always seemed to collide. Cantona had grown up idolizing Platini. He was the French hero, the number 10, the man every young player wanted to be. But by the time Cantona became a star, Platini had moved into politics and power, sitting at the head of UEFA. The legend had turned into the establishment, and Cantona hated everything that stood for. The real clash came during the 2014 World Cup in Brazil. As protests broke out across the country over corruption and rising costs, Cantona always wanted to speak his mind sided with the people. He said the fans had every right to be angry, that football had lost touch with real life. Platini saw it differently. He told reporters the protests were a shame and urged Brazilians to think about the joy the tournament would bring. To Cantona, that sounded like betrayal, a former player choosing politics over passion. He fired back in classic Cantona fashion, accusing Platini of being out of touch, of protecting the system instead of the sport. It wasn't just disagreement, it was symbolic. The rebel artist versus the politician, the street philosopher versus the bureaucrat. The media loved it, of course. Two of France's most iconic number 10 seconds, once united by talent, now split by ideology. Cantona represented freedom, the raw, unfiltered voice of the people. Platini represented control, the rules, the authority, the structure. And between them, the tension revealed something deeper about football itself. That no matter how much the game evolves, there's always a battle between the heart and the hierarchy. Even years later, Cantona didn't soften. When Platini faced his own scandals, Cantona was one of the few who didn't hold back. He called him a politician of football, a man who once loved the game but lost himself in suits and meetings. And though Platini never responded, you could tell the criticism stung. Because coming from Cantona, the same man who grew up idolizing him, it was more than an insult. It was a reminder that Platini, for all his brilliance, had become the very thing he once swore he'd never be. But that wasn't the only fight Platini had left, because his final battle wasn't against a person, it was against football itself. By the end of his career, Michel Platini wasn't just fighting rivals or critics. He was fighting the game he helped build. In interviews, speeches, and even quiet conversations, Platini made one thing clear. He hated what modern football had turned into: too commercial, too controlled, too soulless. He attacked the endless expansion of tournaments, calling the modern Club World Cup a circus built for sponsors, not sport. He accused FIFA of turning passion into profit, saying football was becoming a supermarket full of shiny things but empty of meaning. To him, the modern game was losing its human edge. Players were treated like brands, clubs like corporations, fans like customers. Platini came from a different world, a time when football still felt personal, where legends played for pride more than price tags, and watching that world fade seemed to break something in him. He criticized defensive tactics, saying modern coaches were so afraid to lose that they'd forgotten how to play. He warned that creativity was dying, that the artist, the kind of player who could change a match with one pass, was being replaced by athletes trained to follow orders. In his eyes, the soul of football was being smothered by spreadsheets, politics, and fear. Platini never minced words. He mocked the idea of expanding tournaments for money, questioned video technology, and accused modern administrators of caring more about image than integrity. Every statement felt like another shot fired in a one-man war against the future, and maybe, in a strange way, that's how he wanted it. Because Platini was never built to adapt, he was built to challenge. He had spent his whole life believing football was art, not science, emotion, not economics. So, when the game changed around him, he didn't evolve with it, he fought it. Today, some call him a visionary, others call him bitter, maybe he's both. But one thing's undeniable: Michel Platini never played by anyone else's rules, not as a footballer, not as a president, and not as a man. From teammates who betrayed him, to stars who disappointed him, to a sport that left him behind, Platini's story isn't just about rivalry, it's about resistance. A man who loved football so much, he couldn't bear to watch it become something else. And that's why, even after all these years, one thing remains true: Michel Platini didn't just make enemies, he made a statement, and the game is still arguing with him. When you look back at Michel Platini's story, the friendships, the feuds, the battles, it's easy to see him as a man surrounded by conflict. But underneath it all, there's something deeper. Platini didn't clash with people because he wanted enemies. He clashed because he cared sometimes too much. Every argument, every criticism, every stubborn stand came from the same place: a belief that football should be beautiful, fair, and human. He turned on teammates who betrayed trust. He judged players who didn't live up to their potential. He fought coaches and executives who turned the game into a business. And when the sport he loved began to change beyond recognition, he fought that too. For some, that makes him bitter. For others, it makes him brave. But either way, it makes him unforgettable. Because Platini wasn't just a legend with a ball at his feet, he was a man who refused to let football become something it wasn't. He stood by his vision, even when it cost him everything. And maybe that's why his story still hits so hard, because deep down, every fan knows what it's like to love this game, to see it change, to see it disappoint, and to still believe in what it could be. Michel Platini's life is proof of one thing: you can love football endlessly and still hate what it's become.